Welcome to tonight's Farm Advisory Service. This is the last of our Sustainable Beef Systems Finishing Strong series, focusing on marketing finishing cattle. And to create a sustainable beef industry, we need to balance the environment, social and economic factors. Our previous webinars ensured that we're minimising our impact on the environment from managing nutrition and health. And if our cattle are content and healthy, it makes looking after them easier and a more enjoyable task. So tonight's webinar aims to complete the finishing cycle and tie everything together by focusing on the economic aspect and also a wee bit on the social aspect from a consumer perspective. So as a supply and demand led commodity, we've witnessed record high prices for finished cattle throughout 2025, creating some much needed optimism in the sector. And over the next hour, we'll gain an insight into where the market is at present and how we can maximise the returns. So we've got two great speakers tonight. First is Sarah Balfour, a beef consultant with SAC Consulting based in Thainstone. Our second speaker is Jock Gibson, who wears many hats, including running Pasture for Life Highland Shorthorn cattle system at Edinvale Farm in Dallas and Macbeth Butchers in Forest. But somehow Jock has found the time to complete a Nuffield Scholarship investigating the enhanced meat eating quality from 100% pasture and forage based systems.
Great, thank you, Laura. Yep, no, good evening, everyone. We'll just make a start. What I'm hoping to go through for tonight is looking at sort of current beef market trade for prime cattle, go through some of the factors that are affecting the price just now and have been affecting the prices throughout this last year for prime cattle, have a look at sort of market inspect and how to get the best from cattle and really how to market cattle, and then I've got some sort of key points at the end there, just looking at the sort of global trade and how that affects the trade that we receive here in Scotland for our finished cattle. So first of all, I thought it would be a good starting point would be having a look really at suckler cow numbers and where numbers are in terms of suckler cows in Scotland at the moment, because whether you are a breeder finisher or you're buying in weaned or store calves to finish, ultimately what suckler cow numbers that we have and what critical mass we have in terms of suckler herd numbers dictates and does have an influence on trade. It won't be a surprise. It's no secret. You won't need me to tell you that suckler cow numbers in Scotland are declining, and sort of on average we're looking at a sort of 1% decline year on year. The figures I've put up there go back to 2015. Up until just last year, and between 2015 and 2024 there, we've lost approximately sort of 11.7% of our herd. So it's over 51,000 beef cows that have been lost between years 2015 to last year. Figures from ScotEID show that Scotland lost 3.5% or 394,000 cows between 2022 and 2023. And it's estimated that another 2.5% of the national herd was going to be lost last year. Recent data and census figures that have just been released have actually highlighted that numbers have dropped again between June 2024 and June 2025, that the overall cattle numbers sitting within Scotland has dropped by 14,500. So that's the total number of cattle, not just suckler cows. But it is a huge concern going forward that suckler cow numbers are declining. Yes, this year we've seen that cows are now becoming profitable at long last, and long may this continue. But for some herds, unfortunately, this has come too late, and that numbers have already been lost through various reasons: lack of succession, lack of profitability for some herds, losing tenancies, lack of grazing, lack of land. All this has contributed to declining suckler cow numbers over the years. But as I say, just now there is good confidence within suckler farmers, within suckler herds. We all know the trade that there's been this year for suckled calves, which is a great boost for those with suckled cows. And long may this continue so that we can maintain that critical mass, so that crucially we have these calves that then come through the supply chain. So just looking at UK and also breeding numbers there in Northern Ireland, English suckler herd numbers, they've also fallen, but they've actually fallen more rapidly than what we've seen here in Scotland. And current figures, they're standing about 627,000 head of suckler beef cows in England. And on the back of there being that reduced suckler herd in England, we are seeing that more finishers from south of the border are coming to certainly the bigger spring store sales and the autumn sales now too, to try and buy beef suckled calves, because simply the numbers, they are not there in England, certainly of beef sired calves. Northern Ireland and south of Ireland as well, again, there's reductions there in terms of head of suckler cows. They've reduced in the last 12 months as well. You'll see there that there's, in terms of the south of Ireland, in the last 12 months, suckler cow numbers are down by 50,000. Which is really quite staggering when you consider that the average herd in Ireland is only 16 cows. So that's a lot of herds that have been lost to contribute to that 50,000 head that are actually being lost. I've just popped in there at the bottom there about beef production across the EU, just while we're talking about declining herd numbers and the reduction of suckler numbers. But beef production's also dropped across the EU 8% over the first 6 months of this year, when it's compared with the same period last year. So it's not just Scotland and the UK that is seeing a decline in beef production. It's happening in other nations as well, which I think is an important thing for us all to remember. There we go. So current beef trade. I know that these two graphs are quite busy. There's quite a lot going on in there to see. But yeah, as Laura mentioned right at the start there, 2025 will no doubt, it's going to be remembered for unprecedented price rises, prices peaking, and you can see that in the spring there, back in March and April, when the price there of finished cattle really rocketed on the back of reduced numbers coming forward and strong demand from consumers. And really, the beef trade is a story of supply and demand. So we can see that prices started at the start of this year far higher than where we were in 2024, and against the sort of previous five years. They increased, and you can see that in the steep curve there in the graph. Plateaued, dropped away in the summertime, which is what you would normally expect. There isn't the same demand from consumers in the summer for the prime cuts of beef. And then trade is sort of flatlined. It's plateaued recently, and where we are just now, it's sitting quite static, and compared to this time last year, when Christmas orders were well underway. We're getting towards the end of that now. But usually at this time of year, we do start to see that curve and the prices increase on the back of the demand for prime cuts, as processors look to stock up on prime cuts and prime cattle for Christmas. But we haven't really seen that this year. You'll see there on the graph, it's sort of staying pretty static at the moment. And as I say, with it's now coming to the sort of end of Christmas kill, and certainly Christmas orders are looking to be fulfilled, it's unlikely that the price that we're at the moment is going to dramatically increase. It's certainly not going to increase to the levels where finishers would like it to be on the back of the price that they've paid for some of those expensive store cattle earlier on in the year. So prices currently at the moment for R4L grade steers are looking at about 671 pence per kilo dead weight. There are slight price variations depending on processors and again premiums for Angus and native sired cattle. The graph there on the right hand side of your screen, that again is taken from QMS data, and it just shows prime cattle kill at Scottish abattoirs across the year. As we were saying, and as we've discussed a little bit there, the levels of prime cattle coming to slaughter have reduced. Simply, there hasn't been the same level of calves being born to then come through the system on the back of the declining suckler cow numbers. So this has reduced prime kill at Scottish abattoirs quite significantly, and you can see there on the black line represents 2025, and it's been behind the sort of levels of 2024, the red line, and then we've got it's sort of estimated there that it will come slightly less with the blue line. So beef markets and prices. So as we've said, 2025 has really been the year of record prices. Farm gate prices, they've never been so high at long last. Many farmers are saying how profitable their suckler cow system is in terms of selling calves, and finishers are also talking about profits, although margins are being squeezed slightly at the moment, just with the finished price not increasing as much as what would have been expected ahead of the Christmas kill. We had highs of over £7 a kilo dead weight in the spring on the back of the reduced 2024 calf crop, resulting in less prime cattle coming through, less prime cattle available in 2025. This will likely peak in early spring of 2026, which is on the back of the majority of herds being spring calving in Scotland, and also, as I mentioned earlier, there is those English finishers which are coming up to our Scottish sales to buy cattle. One of the reasons being that beef sired calves are less, the availability is less for them in England. Again, their cows are reducing as well, but also health status, TB status, that all plays a part in how attractive our Scottish beef calves are. So although prices are sitting 9% below where that spring peak was, they're still considerably higher than they were this time last year, so 25% higher. And again, that just reflects the reduced production that there was in 2025, and you can see that in the slaughter graph. There's less cattle coming through, and simply we're short of cattle. The numbers are just not there. A lot of people have been talking about recently about the highs of that £7 a kilo, and there's certainly finishers that will be hoping that prices go back to that again, or they would like to see prices like that again. And the question I sort of was going to put to you, and please feel free to put some answers into the chat. It would be good to get your perspective on it. As the guys that are finishing these cattle, did the prices when they reached over £7 a kilo, so when they were sitting at 720 pence a kilo, did that cause a false economy? So it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on that, please. So store cattle, just touching on the trade for store cattle, at the end of April, during those, the periods of when we have the peak sort of spring sales, many were averaging, 530 pence per kilo. It did depend on sort of breeds as well. But for example, there, a 440 kilo calf was making, well over £2,000 at over £5 a kilo, which was considerably up from December just of the year at the end of the year there, the turn of the year. So it was a huge jump in price, £632, just in quite a short space of time. And the live weight at the same time in 2024, again, that rose considerably, and many producers were quoting £600 to £900 a head more for store cattle, which was great to see, on the back of so many years where margins were really tight, with increased feed costs, increased costs for fertilizer, for fuel, all impacting on the margins that is there with cattle. In June and July of this year, in the summer, prices did fall. Generally, that does happen in the store cattle ring. Simply this year, with grass and with grass availability, finishers, there was a bit of pressure there for grass availability, and with the finished prices also dropping, that then has a knock-on effect with the prices that we get for store cattle. But the strong trade came back again there at the autumn sales. It was store cattle and wean calves, a fly-in trade, a really strong trade for the wean calves at these most recent autumn sales, with many markets averaging over 500 pence a kilo. Some of those sales over in for the West Coast, for likes of Fort William and Skye, they were seen a tremendous trade for these really small calves, which was great to see, because everyone needs a share of the profits. And again, just touching on store cattle, that store cattle prices, they have risen seasonally. They do tend to follow a sort of a seasonal trend, and we're continuing to show considerable year-on-year increases. Again, that just is reflective of the current finished cattle values, but the reduced numbers coming forward. And it's supporting, it's great to have these prices, because it is supporting the confidence of calf producers. Although the current store prices and these high prices being paid are signalling a squeeze for finisher margins. So beef markets and prices. On the back of high prices, and with there being high beef prices, ultimately there is consequences for our consumers. Beef prices have risen by more than 50% in the past 5 years, which is a huge, is a huge jump. Although the overall UK inflation rate has fallen for the first time since March, sitting at 3.6%, food price inflation has increased, with prices on average nearly 5% more expensive than they were in October last year, and that then has a knock-on effect on what our consumers actually go into either our butchers' shops to buy or our supermarkets. It does really affect consumer demand and the price consumers are willing to pay. Figures from AHDB show that over the past 12 months, the average retail price for beef has gone up by 27%. Again, that is a huge jump in price for consumers. And again, from AHDB data, we can see that a kilo of minced beef has typically gone up by 37% to over £6 a kilo there for your sort of standard mince. And mince typically would have been seen as a sort of cheaper beef product, a lower value product, but now in line with the increase in cull cow values and the increase in beef overall, ultimately those prices then have to be passed on to the consumer. And then at the top end there, just at the opposite end, looking from yours, sort of from mince to your fillet steaks, they've gone up considerably as well, which is a bit of a concern, as it is a prime cut of beef. We don't want it to become unaffordable, and we can't help but notice that on quite a few restaurant menus now, that steak it's not there, because consumers are either not eating out as much, or when they are, they're looking at cheaper options. And certainly steak is beginning to look like almost a luxury for some households, dare I say it, but also it's something to enjoy for a special event or a special occasion when it comes to eating out. still sticking with beef markets and prices and sort of the price of red meat. This little graph here, again, it's quite busy. There's quite a lot of lines and sort of data in there. It's taken from QMS, and it's really just to highlight, and it represents the total spend on red meat in Scotland, 12 weeks up to the end of October there. And we can see that spending on red meat actually rose by just over 15% compared to this time last year. But the main driver of that is price inflation. So it's not necessarily that more consumers were going out to purchase red meat and beef. Particularly, it was really on the back of the price inflation, which was affecting that. So we have seen a bit of a shift in consumption, which is against the price pressures. Ultimately, it is about supply and demand. But interestingly, our under 35s, they are beginning to shop more actually for red meat and buy red meat, and particularly beef, more often. They continue to favour mince, which actually accounts for half of their red meat purchases. Again, this data has been supplied by QMS, and around half of the red meat purchase actually is mince. And I suppose that really just highlights that this, that generation and the under 35s preference there for a quick, convenient meal choice for families. Mince is extremely versatile, quick and simple. And it's also value for money, although it has increased in price there. Also, that same report from QMS found that of the under 35s that were surveyed, it was most of them who then said, actually, in this next coming year, they were looking to actually go direct to the butcher or to their local butcher to buy red meat, which again is really encouraging to see. So beef production and looking at how we are paid and how cattle are classified and are finished spec. Our current pricing matrix for beef is based on the Europe grid, which I'm sure you'll all be familiar with if you are, of course, finishing cattle. And basically, this rewards carcass conformation and size, conformation being the shape of the carcass, looking at legs, loin, and shoulder, and the fat describing the fat covering the carcass. And this is represents there on the left-hand side the Europe scale with the fat class along the top there, and then your conformation class down the side. Earlier on, I quoted what current beef prices were sitting at. That was for our grade 4L steers, so you can see that there on the Europe scale, which sits within the sort of green area there, which we've always sort of referred to our 4L grades as being the sort of sweet spot to hit in terms of hitting price and hitting spec. But is that changing? Well, our beef production is changing. Our beef industry is certainly changing, and that's due mainly one of the influences being that since 2014, dairy beef calf registrations have increased greatly by 74%, and we are seeing now that there is a greater influence of dairy beef bred calves in our system. Last year, in 2024, dairy beef bred animals accounted for 37% of prime cattle slaughter. In 2019, 50% of GB prime cattle kill achieved fat class 4L or above. But in 2024, this has changed on the back of a greater influence coming from dairy beef bred animals. This had actually fallen to approximately 41%, achieving that fat class of 4L. There is other reasons for this as well. But it was really just to highlight that there is more dairy beef bred animals certainly now in the system, and that is changing beef production in terms of what we're seeing with carcass weights and carcasses being lighter and leaner. And on the back of that, gradually have achieved lower carcass conformation. Again, really just to touch upon the influence of dairy beef, was the two graphs here just highlight what how cattle have graded out on the Europe scale there, in comparison from 2019 on the left hand side to 2024 on the right hand side there. So there is a marked change that you can see based on some of the factors that we've just discussed there. And again, this one was just to highlight that dairy beef production and dairy beef influence that is in our system now. Market drivers, and what else really affects beef production. There's numerous factors which influence carcass weights and finish. Higher beef prices and favourable feed costs. So when feed costs are lower, incentivises producers to try and increase finishing weights. But equally, when beef prices are lower, animals might be sent to slaughter at lighter weights to get them off farm before prices drop further back. And trends also associate with the weather in terms of the availability of grass, forage, and the practicalities of keeping cattle depending on the weather. If it's a really wet summer, a really dry summer, and available feed and forage, straw for keeping cattle as well affects the market and when cattle are actually sold off farm. So looking forward, if I had a crystal ball, this would be a lot easier. I don't have a crystal ball. Where are we going to be in terms of prices? It's really difficult to say, but I think what's fair and a fair assumption would be that we really need to see more stability. We need more consistency from our processors rather than these huge price fluctuations and huge price variations. They make it so difficult, for budgeting, for feed, for cash flow, for budgeting when you have these huge fluctuations in prices. And the hope is that these higher farm gate prices we're seeing currently, they should increase domestic production. They should encourage more people to keep cows and more farmers certainly to continue with cows and continue with cattle. The difficulty is that the prices that there is associated with cattle now, it's quite difficult for farmers to actually get into buying cattle, just with the sheer volume of money that's that's tied up there with purchasing stock. Just to touch on global beef prices and markets, so prices remain strong across the globe for beef markets. Again, it all comes down to supply and demand is outpacing supply. So short supplies and reduced cattle numbers is supporting prices throughout the world and across the globe. With demand appearing to withstand price growth in major beef consuming nations such as the US. Australian beef production has reached record highs this year. Brazilian beef exports have continued to lift, up by over 16% year on year based on January to September figures, and Brazil remains the world's largest beef exporter, accounting for 28% of the global trade. China's beef imports, they remain firm on the back of falling domestic production and the demand from competitively priced beef elsewhere, mainly from Brazil and Australia.
Evening, folks. I hope you're all well. I'm just going to go through a whistle-stop tour about us and what we do, and then a bit about why we're doing what we do, and a bit about my Nuffield. It might jump around a bit. I'm sorry about that. It's this is a sort of mash-up of a couple of presentations I've done, so bear with me, and hopefully it'll all be fine. For those that don't know me, I'm Jock, and we farm up here at Edinvale in Dallas. I was a building services engineer to trade before coming back to our butcher shop, Macbeth and Forest, and then came back to the farm about 10 years ago. So we've got the farm here and a butcher shop down in Forest, which does a number of different things. A very long-suffering wife, Fiona, and 3 kids. That thing on top of my shoulders is no longer the size that he is in that picture. He's now about 8. And then we've got Ayla and Tilly, who are 13 and 11 respectively. So that's cool. Edinvale we're about 100 acres owned here. We've got 300 acres on a 10-year tenancy, and then 200 acres of seasonal lets. We sit at about 250 head of cattle at any one time, mostly Highland and Shorthorn, and then kids, dogs, and Tim, who helps us on the farm on a reasonably full-time basis, and another guy, Mal, who also doubles up as our delivery driver. Macbeth's was bought in the mid-80s as a way of directly marketing, at that time, pedigree Highland beef. Dad, when he bought the farm, starting off exporting pedigree Highland genetics, and that was going all around the world. But as then and now, the pedigree Highlanders that didn't make breeding grade just weren't fancied in the marketplace. So Macbeth's was bought to try and add value to really good quality beef carcasses, but that just didn't suit a commercial market. At the time, it was a high street retail shop in Forres. Very quickly went into supplying to hotels and restaurants, and then a mail order service as well in the early 90s. So parents would have been one of the first adopters of that. We also privately process for about 25 other businesses, whether they're crofts, local estates, or farms, looking to reach their own marketplace, get direct to the consumer. And that's a service that I'm really proud that we offer. And back of a fag packet, the amount that we've processed this year probably equates to 240,000 in retail value for people to then go direct to the consumer. So up in this part of the world, the butchery scene is pretty thriving. We're a small town in Forres, and there's 2 other butchers, as well as a Tesco's, a Aldi, and a co-op. And then I think we've got in a 30-mile radius, we've got about 15 butchers, and half of that radius is the Moray Firth and then the North Sea. So it's there's quite a lot going on from that point of view. But everything that we do is really geared towards the feedback that we get from our consumer. And the consumer in recent years has become a bit more vocal about what they want, or more specifically concerned with the impacts that we might have as farmers on the environment. They are worried about climate change, biodiversity loss, animal welfare. Increasingly we hear words being used like natural, organic maybe, but really what it boils down to, what they're wanting is a guilt-free eating experience. So they want to be able to enjoy what they're buying and what they're eating. And so that is what we try to do on the farm and in the butchery side of life. So I guess as a farm, we've come from an extensively conventional system using a modicum of feed, originally pedigree Highlanders. We acquired some Aberdeen Angus in the mid-80s, and we introduced Shorthorns in the late 90s. And we have gone down the route of being 100% grass and forage fed. So we're Pasture for Life certified. We're Scotch assured, and we're now looking at organic conversion. And most of this is down to trying to meet the ideals of what we think our customer and our consumer wants in our business. What that means in terms of what we're supplying is we're killing at very modest weights, so anywhere between 500 and 600 live weight, 650 max, and that's producing a fairly modest carcass, grading R4L to O+3, depending on exactly the makeup of the breed. And even though we're just on grass and not even any winter forages now, it's all deferred grazing and bale grazing. We're still killing out at about between 18 to 36 months to sort of get that carcass size. One of the reasons, or a couple of reasons why we're looking at those sort of carcass sizes, and this is increasingly important with where the price of beef has gone to, is we're looking to produce a steak which is easy to cook and has a good eating experience. We can't do that with a really thin steak. These steaks look a bit gammy because they've been frozen, but hopefully it sort of illustrates the point that both of these steaks are the same weight, but because of the carcass size, come out at quite different thicknesses and cross-sectional area, and so we'll have different cooking and eating experiences. So for us, the perfect steak is 8 ounces and it's about 1 inch to 1.5 inches thick. So we need those smaller carcasses to do that. And I guess touching a bit on what Sarah said, that's one of the reasons that we're seeing a rise in popularity with some of the dairy cross beef, especially where it's been crossed to, sucker beef breeds. You're getting that more modest carcass size, which looks really good from a presentational point of view. And frankly, it's more consistent than the suckler beef that's being produced at the moment. So that's one of the reasons that we look at it. The other reason is there's a change in consumer preferences away from roasts, and but we still live as an industry under the illusion that the Sunday roast is a popular thing, or maybe we don't, but we still breed to that. This is some pictures that I've pulled out of the Scottish farmer, and these are all prize-winning cattle. And from my point of view, none of them are particularly big. They're all about 550, 600 kilos live weight. And from my point of view as a butcher, I can look at that and go, we've got good shoulder conformation, and we've got good loin conformation. So actually, the steaks off of these are not going to be huge. They'll butcher well, and we'll be able to cut them well. The problem is when we get to this end, and we've put a lot of time and money into generating muscle that is very difficult now to sell. And you will go into supermarkets, especially at this time of year, and see half-price roasting joints, and so on and so forth. And it is part of an increased Christmas kill looking for loin cuts, premium loin cuts. But with it comes a heap of muscle that the market just no longer wants in the same way that it used to. So yeah, that's where we are with that. So I guess going back to our story a wee bit, because of the way the consumer has changed, we've changed the way that we have farmed. We have gone down this 100% grass-fed route. We are more outdoor reared and outdoor wintered, and looking at organic conversion. And this is all mostly because we're sort of switching to what the consumer tells us they want. And to a certain extent, it's also how we as a family would like to farm. We think it gives us a competitive edge. We think it helps us maintain our social license to do what we're doing. And by and large, it's worked really well. But one of the challenges that we've had is that this eating quality of the steak that we've produced, for example, hasn't eaten quite as well as certainly I would like, and sometimes our consumer would like. And I feel that we've been doing everything right, but not been getting the right result. And so looking at it further is where I've come to my Nuffield topic. And the Nuffield topic was looking at enhanced meat eating quality from grass-fed beef. And I'd gone into it with a preconception that grass-fed beef should be the best that you can buy. And I wasn't getting that result. So I think a lot of people thought that I was going to be traveling around the world, and came back to the conclusion that said grass-fed beef's the best and that's what we should all be doing. It wasn't, but I did have a great opportunity to go and eat a lot of steak, which wasn't a bad outcome. When we talk about meat eating quality, it'll mean different things to different people, but traditionally we've thought about it in terms of flavour, tenderness, succulence, and nutrient density. But increasingly, we look at it in terms of extrinsic values as well. Whether it's grass-fed, grain-fed, indoor reared, outdoor reared, looking at ethics, heritage breeds even, and it's how we layer these attributes onto what we're eating, depending on an individual's principles and likes. It's the Marks and Spencer's thing of this is not just beef, this is Aberdeen Angus, grass-fed, 30-day aged beef. And that increasingly comes into consumers' lexicon. But I think it is worth remembering, and especially when the price of beef is doing what it is or has done this year, there's one factor with meat eating quality that trumps all others, and that's availability. We do have members of society for whom the buying beef is just out of their reach. It's too expensive, and it's one of the challenges that we face when we're looking for better value of our product. And actually, we just we might just be going a bit too far. So in my travels, I was looking at a lot of different systems. The top picture is from Uruguay, which for a small country of only about 3 million people has a cattle population of about 14 million. And then the bottom picture is a feedlot in Australia. So two very different systems, but one of the things that I was looking at is periods of restriction, and how that affects the diet. And I think in some of these previous webinars, it's been looking at nutrition and so on and so forth. But one of the other things that I came across is that grass-fed beef is not necessarily considered the best worldwide. In a lot of places, grain-fed would have a premium. And going back to Australia again, a lot of the places you can buy grass-fed, you can buy 30-day grain finished, 60-day grain finished, and there's no judgment. You pick what you want, and you buy it and you eat it, and hopefully you enjoy it. The grass-fed element is predominantly a privileged European ideal, but one of the things that I did come across repeatedly was the requirement for consistency. And when we talk about consistency, it's also what are we consistently trying to achieve? Is it consistently tasty? Is it consistently tender? Or are we producing something that is consistently tough, or consistently bland? And so started to look at some of the things that we need to be looking at to try and achieve that consistency, particularly in grass-fed beef, but also it's applicable to sort of all systems. And the first one came up with was compensatory growth, particularly in outwintering systems, and particularly in the sort of grass-based systems or forage-based systems, one of the arguments that I was getting was we should be able to outwinter successfully in the UK because they can do it in America and Canada, and it's -30 over there. And indeed, it is -30 and sometimes cold over there, but it's really dry. And so we have cattle in the UK being outwintered who are really struggling to combat that wetness that we get here. And what that can do is it really drops growth rates, but we often use compensatory growth to get to a point where we're then getting to the required weight and conformation. But what happens with that is during the low growth period, there's a risk that we can start catabolizing muscle, and that muscle will turn to gristle. And the outcome we get is pretty chewy and unappealing. So compensatory growth is an economic argument rather than an argument for good meat eating quality. The other one that I came across was the glycogen bucket, the holy glycogen bucket, which is it's a holy bucket in that it has holes, not that it is a demigod of eating quality. But this came from Australia, and basically it is a visual way of looking at what we're trying to do to feed animals to build up muscle glycogen. And muscle glycogen will deplete all the time with stress, but we can feed our way to increasing muscle glycogen. It's important because as post-mortem muscle glycogen converts to lactic acid, which in turn helps reduce pH in the muscle post-mortem, which means in turn that we don't get dark cutting and stressed meat. And so it's one of the ways that they introduce a huge amount of consistency in Australia is by looking at this. But in a grass system, it's hard to do because the quality of forage varies over the year. So spring, early summer, it's very hard to build up these muscle glycogen levels. But as we go into summer and autumn, we can do it with greater consistency into higher sustained levels, which means, again, that, well, it probably means that there's a level of seasonality to grass-fed beef that we don't get in this to the same extent in a grain-finished equivalent. The last one was that we have an opportunity to breed and feed to balance flavour and tenderness, and this is very much a trade-off that we can play depending on the market that we're trying to reach. So by and large, as we go from a younger age to slaughter to an older age, the meat profile goes from tender with more subtle flavour characteristics to one that is a bit more full of flavour, but have a bit more bite, and a bit might be a bit more connective tissue as it gets older, as the potential for adverse growth effects increases over time. But it's quite an important vector to play with depending on our market. To make the most of this and not to just reduce all of that to an academic exercise, there are some opportunities that we can take in this country. The first is that we need to measure and reward for eating quality. At the moment, we measure and reward for a size and a shape, but that doesn't give us the consistency and the reward that our consumer is looking for. Eating quality is not going to suit every producer, but it does give a bit more choice for farmers to fit into a production system that is appropriately rewarded. The other is that if we are to recognise good meat eating quality, we also need to recognise the bad. And so we need to have a failure rate. Again, in Australia, to be graded with Meat Standards Australia, the beef must be first in the right pH range, marbling score and fat depth before being further graded with eating quality outcomes for particular cuts and cooking methods. And because they're going through that process, they can help people cook the beef appropriately. We quite often blame poor outcomes on the cook, but how often do we set the cook up to fail? So it's trying to get to that place where we're giving them that feedback and what they can do with it. In terms of what we're doing here, we're changing our breeding programs so that we're reducing tail end of our cattle with the really long days to slaughter, particularly the pure Highlanders. The other thing is we're really trying to hone in our 200, 400 day management, that really lean, long winter that we get here, to try and get young stock through that a bit quicker. And we're also looking at what data we collect and how we analyze it so that it influences what we do in the future. It would be remiss of me if I'm talking about my Nuffield not to talk about sponsors, particularly Royal Highland Agricultural Society of Scotland and Worshipful Company of Butchers, who've helped me on my eating extravaganza, and obviously work colleagues and family as well. So, yeah, and that's me. I think that we'll go with that.
So we've got a couple come in. So in relation to your question at the beginning there, Sarah, about what did you think of the $7.20 a kilo, what was that feeling? So one of our attendees said that there was a concern at that point that the increased price received at the farm gate would result in the price for consumers escalating beyond a feasible level. So we're looking at now that we've seen the price at the farm gate fall back a bit from that heavy heights that we've seen in the springtime. So have we seen similar prices fall in the retail side of things?
Yes and no. So supermarkets and they have sort of, they have their price promotions to try and encourage spending on beef. It's no secret that when prices reach those high levels back in the springtime, and that the prices started to filter down to the consumer in sort of May, June, early into the early summer months, that we saw that there was more imported beef coming onto the supermarket shelves. We've seen Asda, Morrison's, all of the sort of big supermarkets were importing beef simply because they could sell that at a cheaper price bracket than our own Scotch beef, which was worrying. Prices at the moment, I would say in the shelves, they haven't really come back. There is price promotions, that are on the go to try and encourage spending. We've got the Christmas TV adverts, which are trying to push the sales of roasts and try and push premium products at this time of year. Christmas adverts, they've become synonymous with the run up to Christmas, and the meat industry is no different for that. So supermarkets are they're trying their best to get consumers in the door, but there is still quite a high price tag for many consumers for beef on the shelves, I would say.
Yeah.
If I might add to that, one thing I would say is when the price was really rising at the start of the year, there was a lag between where maybe butchers were and the price that they were having to charge and where the supermarkets were, because of the way contracts are going on sort of rolling 3-month contracts. And it's only in the last 2-3 months, I would say, the consumer has really noticed where supermarket prices have gone to, whereas butchers have maybe been there for 3 months already. So there was a real disparity between where a supermarket pricing was because they were on an old contract to where butchers were having to be.
Yeah, and I suppose following on from that as well, we've seen an increase in footfall into the high street butchers now. Do you think that will continue over long term?
I'm obviously going to say yes, but trying to put a bit of impartiality on it. I think when the consumer is faced with really high prices, there's a number of choices that they'll make. The one that is prepared to spend a lot of money will maybe then go and look to see where they can absolutely get where they want what they want, or they might be expect other additional things, whether it's advice or a bit more tailoring to the products that they want. And so that's when butchers really come into their own. For those that, and I think we've probably seen this a little bit, with those that think that they can't afford the beef, they maybe go and look at another protein. So, we've seen volumes of beef drop off, and we've seen it in our own business, particularly to food service. We've seen customers and consumers move to different proteins, whether it's venison or whether it's a bit more pork, a bit more poultry. They will go elsewhere.
I think that there is definitely a tendency just now that to look at the sort of the lower cuts, the cheaper cuts. The mince is popular, but I think an important thing too just to highlight is that although mince is maybe seen as being a sort of lower cut or a lesser cut, it's still a really high, good nutritional beef product, and we still need to promote that as well. So although maybe consumers are not looking to buy the roasts and the steaks, as long as they are still buying into the Scotch brand and buying the mince and buying manufacturing processing beef, it still helps to keep trade buoyant and helps to keep the market together.
Yeah, that's it. And I think then it leads to the challenge then being carcass balance for the likes of yourself, Jock, that you've got a beast and all bits of it have to go, and it's a shame to put some of these premium steaks through the mincer just to meet what the consumer wants.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we saw it back in 2008, I think it was, as well. When the price goes like this, it actually helps carcass balance, because prime cuts are such a small proportion of the whole carcass that you sell less of the higher price cuts, obviously, and the lower prices come into the fore where there's a greater volume of the carcass anyway. Where we're still struggling slightly is that hind quarter, where we are struggling to utilize that in the best way, and see traction on that. But yeah, if at the moment carcass balance is helped by where we are in our experience.
Good. So then, Sarah, in your presentation, you showed that suckler cow numbers have been falling. Are we starting to see, in response to the better prices, that more heifers are being retained for breeding, or are we still seeing the same amount of heifers coming through in the finished stocks, or even potentially increasing?
I think so. This last year, with beef prices where they've been in terms of the price that that cattle are making, it is a real incentive now for farmers to keep heifers and to increase herds. Certainly at the sort of the back end there, autumn breeding sales, all markets and auctioneers we're talking about record prices for in-calf heifers. There was a real demand for heifers. So I would say there's certainly more heifers on farm, and going through this winter. Figures and data looks, and it's certainly pointing towards that there's going to be more in-calf heifers coming through to calve in the springtime, which is great. It's great to see. We need to maintain those numbers for critical mass. As I say, there is a real incentive to keep cows, but it doesn't happen overnight. You need the time to rear that heifer, to get her to bulling age, to get her in calf, to then get that calf on the ground, to then get it weaned, to get through the system. So it will take time to build numbers up, but there's certainly a real incentive there for it.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, Sarah, the critical mass. So how far away are we from that kind of target or optimal level?
Good question. QMS, earlier on in the year had said that if farmers look to keep 2 more extra cows per head, that we would help to increase critical mass and help towards being self-sufficient. Interestingly, with cow numbers and where suckler cow numbers are, it really comes down to, I suppose, economics of the economics of scale in terms of the number of cows. You know that we have 56% now of Scotland's suckler cow numbers are on 16% of holdings. So yeah, when it comes to sort of critical mass, where it's bigger, we're seeing bigger herds now than we have before.
And then, Jock, we've got a couple of questions for you. When you were on your travels, what was the average age of slaughter in the countries you visited? Was there as much pressure on them to be under 30 months as there maybe is in this country?
Yeah, I mean, they were still going for about 24 months was the average age. Uruguay was different. It was nearly 48 months. They have quite a big challenge in terms of really long dry periods. So, I think when I was there, they were just coming off the back of a 16-month dry period, and they're not feedlotting there. Everything is rangeland, grass pastures. So they were slightly different, but a lot of South America, Australia, New Zealand was 24 months. Angus, Hereford genetics, again, small carcasses. They weren't producing huge carcasses by any stretch of the imagination. Some place in Australia will be heavily continental, but yeah.
Good, yes. And then we've got a question here. Can we top up our glycogen bucket by pre-slaughter by changing the diet in the final few days? Because Neil here is thinking about cutting them off feed before shipping, but maintaining a wee bit of barley because we're still green feeders in Shire.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's a bad shout. A lot of stress in an animal, especially pre-slaughter, is change of environment, but also change in nutrition. So I think, and it's one of the challenges, taking them off feed pre-slaughter so that they're empty when they go down the line. But that is quite stressful. So it's trying to get that balance between maintaining nutrition to keep stress levels minimized, but glycogen levels high. By and large, glycogen levels are built up over a period of time, but they can leak out quite quickly. So don't know if that really answers the question, Neil, but
we've seen in the poll that most of our audience are from they're selling through the direct to slaughter, so they maybe miss out on that feedback loop that Jock has there about eating quality, being able to sell through the butchery shop. So where do they see the biggest opportunities for finishers to add value when that feedback link is sort of missing?
Big question. I mean, it is, for me anyway, it is how you are supplying direct into a processor that you maybe get that link back. I'm very envious of the Uruguayan system where you can see your store that you've sold, and you can still see that right the way through to the point of kill. So you get all that data back, including the price that it makes and everything like that. I have reservations as to whether the live ring is the best place to be selling prime cattle that are going direct to slaughter, purely from the point of eating quality and just what the stress of that does to it. And so I think it's having that minimal amount of moves and as quickly as possible into a processor where you can try and get some of that feedback. But also we need a system that can measure it.
So I think tonight's key takeaway messages are that there's a very obvious decline in suckler cow numbers, and this is not unique to Scotland, which has driven up the reduced the supply, I should say, but the demand remains strong, and that is not, again, unique to Scotland. That is globally. Consumer preferences are changing, as we've seen. The cuts are being favoured by younger generations, are perhaps not the same as maybe what we are designing our cattle to look like. But I think the ultimate message is to know your market and tailor it to it, and take every bit of feedback you can get. It's amazing the amount of information you can get in your kill sheet in terms of the conformation and also health issues that's there just to help with your spec. So along with the email, you will receive a feedback survey. Would really appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes to complete that form, give us all the feedback, positive, negative, indifferent, because it's only from that information we know what you need from us to deliver through the Farm Advisory Service. And with that, we will just end tonight's webinar. So thank you for coming along tonight. Hope you found this series enjoyable. And if you've missed anything, you can catch up on our recordings on the YouTube channel or on the Farm Advisory Service website. But thank you for joining us, and good night.